The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. The Hebrew Bible has gigantes, giants, in this verse. The second wording in Genesis 6:1-4 to note is the comment that there were giants before the flood and also afterward. But some people think that this wording opens the door to something else. Specifically, that it opens the door to giants, to Nephilim, being part of end times biblical prophecy.
All right, guys. Was the giant of Kandahar spotted? It says newly surfaced photos claim to show one of the giants of Kandahar. And I've covered this topic before, talking to L.A. Marzulli, explaining that this happened from some military operations and one died. It's all so crazy and wild. But here's the problem. AI is getting so real. How in the world do we tell what is fake and what is real? Like, seriously, how can we tell? So check this out. Here's one photo. Like, look, it just looks like super far away. Looks super far away, and he's walking out. That's insane. What in the world? Images have exploded across local mountain communities today. 3 shocking photos that claim to show one of the legendary giants of Kandahar. The pictures, reportedly taken by villagers living in the remote edges of Kandahar mountains, reveal a towering, long-haired humanoid shape moving along a rocky ridge out of a cave at dawn. The locals snapped with a shot and said they originally thought it was a massive wandering animal until it stood up upright. According to long circulating stories, the giant of Kandahar has been whispered about generations. Massive humanoid things said to roam hidden valleys and abandoned cave systems. The most infamous encounter is a story told by soldiers who claim to have confronted a colossal spear-wielded giant buried deep within the cavern. For years, these encounters were dismissed as rumors, myths, and military folklore. Till now, the villagers who took those photos say they heard heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoing through the rocks, followed by a figure as tall as 2 men stacked on each other emerging into the view. That's insane. Let's see here, though. What do the comments say? I want to see these comments. Now that AI is out, the internet isn't really that interesting. So many videos surfacing since the age of AI. First round draft pick for sure. Yeah, thanks to AI, I believe nothing I see on social media. So that brings up a lot of speculations, as a lot of people think that the end times have to do with Nephilim. And I want to bring up Dr. Michael Heiser, and he explains whether or not he thinks if the Nephilim will return because of the Days of Noah verse. So let's get into it, let's see if they have any claims.
As we proceed, the Old Testament of the Bible includes several stories about ancient giants. Goliath, of course, his battle with David is the most familiar. But Genesis 6:1-4 tells us there were giants long before David and Goliath. Those verses read as follows: When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now there are some key wordings in this passage, which is situated sometime before the great biblical flood, which is Genesis 6-9. The first is Nephilim. Now this word can mean giants, and was certainly taken that way by ancient translators of the Old Testament. For example, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, has gigantes, giants, in this verse. The second wording in Genesis 6:1-4 to note is the comment that there were giants before the flood and, quote, also afterward, unquote. The Bible, of course, describes some of these, the most...
Like, I can see why people would think that. That just seems like, oh, afterward. Obviously, we see of giants later on in the Old Testament, and he explains that. And then Jesus saying it will be like the days of Noah. What was going on during the days of Noah? Is it just people being wicked, or is there something else going on?
Famous again is Goliath. But there are also others. Og, and the Rephaim in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, and the Anakim in Numbers 13. But some people think that this wording opens the door to something else.
Yep.
Specifically, that it opens the door to giants, to Nephilim, being part of end times biblical prophecy. Now, why would someone make that leap? Why argue such a point? And is the claim valid? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today in this episode of Fringe Pop 321. Now, we're talking about why it is that some Bible students and those who are just sort of more conspiratorially minded insist that the biblical end times will include a return of the Nephilim. The short answer is Matthew 24. This is referred to as the Olivet discourse by theologians and Bible scholars. And that chapter of the Gospel of Matthew is typically the launching point for this idea. In that passage, Jesus, when asked by his disciples to divulge when the climactic events of the end would occur, replied in part, quote, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man." Well, that's Matthew 24, 36 through 39.
To me, when I hear that, I hear like, well, that seems pretty obvious. You just put the two and two together, and then marrying and giving in marriage. I'm interested to see what he has to say here, because marrying and giving in marriage definitely seems like a very sus thing to say, unless you're talking about
Roughly in the ESV. Now, I'm guessing that you can see already why this passage is used for the Nephilim return thesis, again, coming back in the end times. Matthew 24 compares the end of days with the days of Noah and mentions marrying and giving in marriage. That last phrase, marrying and giving in marriage, supposedly points directly to Genesis 6:2, where we read, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose." Now, if that's the case, so the argument goes, we ought to expect more Nephilim in the end times. Again, that's the argument. So this is what we need to think about as we proceed. The evidence for the claim that Nephilim will return in the last days seems strong, given the apparent parallel between Matthew 24 and Genesis 6. But the similarity is actually more surface than substance. Let's ask ourselves a question. If Jesus had wanted his listeners to think of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, or Matthew had wanted his readers to think of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, would it not make sense, wouldn't it be reasonable, that we would find quotations of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 in Matthew 24? Now you're probably wondering, why are you even asking? Isn't that what we just read? Doesn't Matthew quote Genesis 6:2 in his marrying and giving in marriage line, giving us the context for the days of Noah in Matthew's gospel? Well, it sure looks that way.
Yeah.
In English. The problem is that the New Testament wasn't written in English. It was written in Greek. And Matthew would be quite capable of quoting the Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, if he wanted readers to think of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. That's what you would do. So that means we need to ask ourselves the question in a different way. If Jesus or Matthew wanted listeners and readers to think of Genesis 6:2, and Matthew actually doesn't quote it, what do we have then? Now, I think it's perfectly reasonable, again, to defend the idea of Nephilim in the end times using Matthew 24, to expect a quotation. You wouldn't quote anything else if you were trying to make the point, and so if we don't have the quotation, we've got something else. Turns out all we need to do to know conclusively which direction this is going to go, does Matthew in fact quote the Greek translation of the Old Testament in his Greek gospel or not, It's very easy to find out. All we need to do is set side by side the Greek of Matthew 24 in the relevant places with the Greek of the Septuagint from Genesis 6, 1 through 4, right next to it. And this is what you're looking at on the screen. Whether you can read the Greek or not, you can actually see what the answer is. You can see the verdict. All you need to do is visually see if the words are the same. And you can visually see that, no, they're not. The Greek of Matthew 24 is different than the Greek of Genesis 6, 1 through 4.
Wow.
And the implication, therefore, is obvious.
So is he saying that he thinks that the Nephilim will not return, according to that verse? But couldn't you just say in the last days it will be as if it was in the days of Noah? That just from that quote itself could mean a possibility of the Nephilim creatures, don't you think? I don't know, or no.
Matthew is not quoting Genesis 6:2 when he gives us his marrying and giving in marriage line. And that should tell us that Matthew was not thinking of Genesis 6:2 in what he wrote, because if he was, it would stand to reason that he would actually quote the passage.
Wow.
Consequently, Matthew 24, 36 through 39 isn't about a return of the Nephilim or a repetition of what happened in Genesis 6:2. Aside from not quoting the Greek text of Genesis 6:2 on Matthew's part, there are other problems with the way Matthew 24, 36 through 39 is used to defend the idea of a Nephilim return. If Matthew was really referencing Genesis 6, 1 through 4, there's something else that you would not expect him to do. Specifically, you would not expect Matthew to insert additional details for the days of Noah, details that are never mentioned in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Because again, if that's the passage he's thinking of, he knows where to find it in his Old Testament, and he could just as well quote it for what it says, and now not insert more details that aren't there. Because if you inserted other details, that would sort of confuse your reader. You wouldn't know if he was really wanting you to think about Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It just wouldn't make sense. Now, here's Matthew's list of what was going on in, quote, the days of Noah. Eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and not watching or being unaware of what was going on. Only one of those three items could be associated with Genesis 6, 1 through 4, in theory, the marrying and giving in marriage part. But as we've seen above, Matthew isn't actually drawing his vocabulary from the Greek translation of Genesis 6:2. So even that correlation is, of course, misguided. The other items in Matthew 24 that Matthew actually does have listed have no association with the supernatural or angelic aspects of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. They're not there.
Wow.
So why would we, as modern readers or interpreters, impose the supernatural character of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 onto what Matthew says when A, he doesn't quote it, and B, he adds details that aren't in the Genesis 6 passage.
Dang, that's crazy. Very fascinating. It's weird because he's very into like the supernatural and the unseen realm and the Nephilim and aliens and even aliens type stuff. Like he's interested in that stuff. But I'm curious then, how do you explain this phenomenon, all these things that are happening within this world, if he doesn't think that the Nephilim will return? Or maybe they just have it left. It says in those days the Nephilim will be there, in those days. I mean, the Nephilim were there and then they were there afterwards. I'm curious. I wish he was still around. Like, he would do amazing. I wish he would explain more.
Activities of eating and drinking and not watching or being unaware are completely human. Again, we don't need angels or sons of God for any of that. They have nothing to do with visitors from heaven and the kind of context that Genesis 6:2 gives us. Insisting that Matthew 24 align with Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is therefore pretty arbitrary. The interpretation lacks coherence. Lastly, there's one more reason to not expect Nephilim in the end times. The idea actually runs completely contrary to the Bible's own accounting of the giants, the descendants of the Nephilim, or the Nephilim that were on earth after the flood. According to the Old Testament, the last of the giants were killed off in the time of David. This, of course, is Goliath, but it also includes his brothers. Beyond David's time, there are no more giants in the biblical storyline.
Wow.
So while the idea might make a good movie, it doesn't make good biblical interpretation.
Dang.
Thanks for watching Fringe Pop 3.
He just shut down that idea. That's wild. What do you guys think? But nonetheless, guys, like the sons of God, these angelic beings are trying to do the same thing. But is there any other place that the Bible brings that up besides in the days of Noah? That's crazy. I know Chuck Missler does think that. Man, I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments below for sure. This one is very interesting. It just seems like there's so many not paranormal, just like crazy things happening within this world. And I think that would explain a lot, but who knows? Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. I encourage you to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't. And always remember, guys, Jesus loves you.